I was fixing his belt, just a simple favor. But when his pants slipped and our eyes locked, everything changed. The look he gave me wasn't innocent. It wasn't what a stepson should feel. My heart raced, my hands froze, and in that moment, I knew we had crossed a line we could never uncross. I wanted to stop it, but part of me didn't. My name is Jessica, and for most of my life, I thought I had everything under control. I married young, built a stable home, and settled into the rhythm of family life. My husband, Mark, was dependable, steady in every way that counted. But sometimes steady starts to feel stagnant. Mark had a son, Ryan, from his first marriage. When we got married, Ryan was just a shy teenager who barely spoke to me. Over the years, I tried to bridge the gap, and eventually he started to open up. By the time he was in his early 20s, we had developed a close bond. One that felt more like friendship than the traditional stepmother-stepson relationship. But lately something had shifted. Ryan wasn't the awkward kid he used to be. He had grown into a confident, charming young man, broad shoulders, piercing eyes, and an easy smile that could disarm anyone. He started spending more time around me, lingering in conversations and offering compliments that felt different. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into things. After all, I was married. I was his stepmother. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the way my heart skipped a beat when he looked at me, or how I suddenly felt the need to dress up even when I wasn't going anywhere. Mark was away often for work, leaving me and Ryan alone in the house. It was harmless at first, movie nights, casual dinners, but then came the little moments. The accidental touches. The way his gaze lingered just a second too long. And then came the night it all changed. Ryan knocked on my door, asking for help with his belt. It seemed innocent enough, but the way his voice trembled made my pulse quicken. I told myself it was nothing, just a wardrobe malfunction. But as I reached out to fix it, his pants slipped slightly, and our eyes met. The tension was instant, electric. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. That was the moment I realized we'd crossed into dangerous territory. And no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise, there was no going back. The days after that moment with Ryan felt different, charged like the air before a storm. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting incident, but the memory lingered. Every time I saw him, I felt it. At first, I tried to act normal, laughing at his jokes, cooking dinner, and watching movies like we always did. But things weren't the same. The way he looked at me felt deliberate now, as if he was waiting for me to acknowledge something we weren't supposed to talk about. One evening, we were sitting in the living room, and he brushed against me as he reached for the remote. It could have been an accident, but the way he paused, his arm lingering just long enough for me to notice, told me it wasn't. "Sorry," he said, but his eyes stayed on me unblinking. "It's fine," I replied, forcing a smile. But it wasn't fine. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the moment over and over. I told myself I was overthinking it, but a part of me knew better. I wasn't imagining it. The next morning, Ryan came into the kitchen shirtless, yawning as he poured himself a cup of coffee. "Morning," he said, his voice low and raspy. I looked up from the stove and froze. His body was lean and toned, and I hated myself for noticing. "Morning," I replied quickly, turning back to the eggs I was cooking. "Thanks again for helping me the other day," he said casually. I stiffened. It wasn't a big deal. "It felt like it," he said softly. I turned around, and his eyes were already on me. There was something in his gaze, something that made my stomach twist. I tried to ignore it, but the tension was suffocating. "Ryan, we need to talk," I said, setting the spatula down. He leaned against the counter, folding his arms. "About what?" "About boundaries." "Boundaries?" He smirked, but his eyes didn't match the playfulness in his voice. I didn't realize I'd crossed any. "You haven't," I said quickly, but even I didn't believe it. "I just think we need to be careful about." "Careful about what?" he interrupted, stepping closer. "About how we feel." I froze. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, my voice barely steady. "You feel it too," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Don't you?" "Ryan, stop." But he didn't. "Just admit it," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "There's something here, and you know it." I couldn't breathe. "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied, stepping back. But he didn't back down. "Fine," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Pretend all you want. But we both know this isn't nothing." And then he walked out, leaving me trembling in the kitchen. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake the conversation, but his words kept replaying in my mind. The way he said it, the confidence in his voice, made it impossible to dismiss. That night I avoided him. I stayed in my room, pretending I was busy with work. But when I finally lay down to sleep, I couldn't stop thinking about him, his words, his touch, his eyes. I knew I should put a stop to this before it went any further. I knew I should talk to him, set clear boundaries, and remind him that this was wrong. But part of me didn't want to, and that terrified me. The tension between Ryan and me only grew stronger after that night in the kitchen. I tried to avoid him, to bury myself in chores and errands, but it didn't matter. He was always there, lingering, watching, waiting. And the worst part, I didn't hate it. I hated myself for not hating it. One evening, Mark was out of town for work, and Ryan and I were alone in the house. I told myself it was fine, we'd been alone before. But this time it felt different. The air felt heavier. I was folding laundry in the living room when Ryan walked in, wearing nothing but sweatpants. "You're really working hard," he said, sitting down on the couch too close. "Just trying to keep busy," I said, avoiding his gaze. He leaned back, watching me. "You don't have to be nervous around me, you know." I froze, my hands tightening around the shirt I was folding. "I'm not nervous," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Really?" he asked, leaning forward. "Because you've barely looked at me all week." I set the shirt down and turned to face him. "Ryan, we need to talk." "No, we don't," he said, cutting me off. "We've talked enough. Now I need to know something." I swallowed hard. "What?" He stood up, moving closer. "Why haven't you told me to stop? Why haven't you pushed me away?" "Because it's not like that," I said quickly, but the words felt hollow. He shook his head. "Don't lie to me. You feel it too. I see the way you look at me." I opened my mouth to argue, but before I could speak, he stepped even closer, close enough for me to feel his breath on my skin. "Tell me you don't feel it," he whispered. I couldn't. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't say the words. "Ryan, this is wrong," I said, but my voice was barely above a whisper. "Then stop me," he said, his eyes locked on mine. I didn't move, and that was all the invitation he needed. His hand brushed against mine, and my breath hitched. The heat between us was undeniable, and for a moment I let myself give in. His fingers traced my wrist, sending shivers through my body. "Ryan, we can't," I said again, but even as I spoke, I didn't pull away. "You don't want me to stop," he said, his voice low and steady. His confidence terrified me and thrilled me. Before I could stop him, his lips were on mine. It was soft at first, hesitant, testing, but it quickly deepened. My hands moved to his chest, and for a brief, dizzying moment, I let myself get lost in it. But then reality hit me like a freight train. I pushed him away, my heart racing. "No!" I gasped, stepping back. "This can't happen." He looked. He looked at me, his chest rising and falling as if he was struggling to catch his breath. "Why not?" he asked, his voice low and desperate. "Because it's wrong." I snapped, backing away further. "You're my stepson, Ryan. We can't do this." His eyes softened, and he stepped closer again. "You're not my real mom," he said, his words hanging heavy in the air. "That doesn't matter." I shot back, but the crack in my voice betrayed me. The space between us felt suffocating, and I could feel the heat radiating off him as he stood there, staring at me like I was the only thing that mattered. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said quietly. "And I know you feel it too." I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about him either. "I need you to leave," I said finally, my voice trembling. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine for any sign that I didn't mean it. And for a terrifying moment, I wasn't sure if I did. But then he nodded, stepping back. "Fine," he said, his voice tight. "But this isn't over." I watched as he turned and walked out of the room, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The next few days were unbearable. Ryan avoided me, and when we did cross paths, the tension was so thick it felt like the walls were closing in. I thought the distance would make things easier, but it didn't. It only made me think about him more, about his touch, his voice, the way his eyes had locked on mine. I hated myself for wanting him. One night, I found myself outside his bedroom door. I told myself I was just going to check on him, to make sure he was okay. But when I knocked and he opened the door, the look in his eyes told me he wasn't okay at all. "Can we talk?" I asked. He stepped aside, letting me in. We sat down on the edge of his bed, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "I'm sorry," he said finally. I looked at him, surprised. "For what?" "For pushing you," he said. I don't know how to stop feeling this way." I felt my chest tighten. "You have to, Ryan. We both do." "But what if I can't?" he asked, his voice breaking. I wanted to comfort him, to reach out and take his hand. But I knew if I did, I wouldn't be able to stop myself. Instead, I stood up. "We need space," I said firmly. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't name. Is that what you really want? No, I thought. Yes, I said. But as I walked out of the room, I knew I was lying, to him and to myself. And the worst part, I wasn't sure if I cared. The night everything fell apart, the house was quiet, too quiet. Mark was out of town again, and Ryan and I were left alone under the same roof. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that we could coexist like we always had. But deep down, I knew something was bound to happen. I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Ryan. I felt his presence before I saw him. Can we talk? He asked, his voice low and serious. I froze for a moment before slowly turning to face him. About what? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. You know what? He said, stepping closer. I took a step back, pressing my hands against the counter, as if I needed something solid to keep me grounded. Ryan, we've already talked about this, I said firmly. No, we haven't, he shot back. We danced around it. We pretended it wasn't real. But it is, Jessica. It's real, and you know it. I swallowed hard. It doesn't matter if it's real. It's wrong. Then why haven't you stopped me? He demanded. His words hit me like a slap, and I felt the walls I'd built around myself begin to crumble. Because I don't know how, I admitted, my voice breaking. That was all it took. In a single stride, he closed the space between us, his hands cupping my face. My breath hitched as his lips hovered inches from mine. Tell me to stop, he whispered. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Jessica. And then his lips were on mine. For a moment, I gave in. I let myself feel it, the heat, the urgency, the hunger. My fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer as the world around us faded away. But then reality came crashing down. I pushed him away, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. No! I gasped. This can't happen. He stepped back, his eyes searching mine for something, anything, but all he saw was panic. You want this, he said, his voice shaking. Why won't you just admit it? Because it's wrong, I shouted. The sound of my voice echoed through the kitchen, and for a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. Then, before either of us could speak, the front door opened. Jessica! Mark's voice froze us both in place. Panic shot through me as Ryan stepped back quickly, running a hand through his hair as if that could erase what had just happened. In here! I called out, forcing my voice to sound normal even as my heart pounded in my chest. Mark walked into the kitchen, smiling, completely unaware of what he'd just interrupted. Hey, he said, setting his bag down. What's going on? Nothing, I said quickly. We were just talking. Mark's eyes flicked between us, and I saw the flicker of suspicion in his gaze. Talking, he repeated slowly. Ryan cleared his throat. Yeah, just about some stuff at work. Mark didn't look convinced, but he didn't press. Okay, he said finally. Well, I'm starving. What's for dinner? I forced a smile and turned back to the stove, pretending everything was fine. But I could feel Ryan's eyes on me, and I knew this wasn't over. Later that night, as I lay in bed next to Mark, I couldn't stop replaying what had happened in the kitchen. The way Ryan had looked at me, the way I'd kissed him back, and the way Mark had looked at us, like he knew something wasn't right. I barely slept. Every sound, every creak of the house made me jump, as if the truth was seconds away from exploding. The next morning, Mark left for work early, and I finally allowed myself to breathe. But before I could figure out what to do, Ryan came into the room. We need to talk, he said. No, we don't, I replied, trying to push past him. But he grabbed my arm, stopping me. Don't do this, he said. Don't shut me out. Ryan, I can't do this, I said, my voice trembling. You have to stop. He stared at me for a long moment before finally letting go. I'm not going to stop, he said quietly. Not until you tell me you don't feel it too. And then he walked away, leaving me standing there, completely unraveling. That night, Mark came home early. I was sitting in the living room, trying to hold myself together, when he walked in and closed the door behind him. We need to talk, he said. My stomach dropped. About what? About Ryan. I froze. What about him? I see the way he looks at you, Mark said, his voice dangerously calm. And I see the way you look back. I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Is there something going on between you two? He demanded. No, I said quickly. Of course not. Don't lie to me, he shouted. Tears filled my eyes as I shook my head. I'm not lying. But I was. And he knew it. Mark stared at me for a long time before finally turning and walking out the door. And just like that, everything fell apart. The silence that followed Mark's departure was deafening. I sat on the couch, staring at the door he'd just walked through, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to chase after him, to beg him to stay, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Ryan came downstairs a few minutes later, his face pale as he looked around. "Where's Mark?" he asked cautiously. "He left," I said flatly, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan hesitated before stepping closer. "Because of us?" "There is no us," I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. His eyes darkened. "Don't lie to me. After everything that's happened, don't you dare lie to me now." I stood up, my hands trembling. "You don't understand what you've done." "What I've done?" he shot back. "You kissed me. You didn't stop me. You wanted this just as much as I did." The truth in his words hit me like a slap, and I had no defense. I had let this happen. I had crossed the line. And now I was paying the price. "I need you to leave," I said, my voice barely steady. He stared at me, his jaw tightening. "No, Ryan. I'm not leaving you like this," he said. "Not when you're falling apart." I wanted to scream, to push him away, but the desperation in his eyes made my anger falter. "I can't do this," I said, my voice breaking. "This is wrong. It was always wrong." "Then why did it feel so right?" he asked, stepping closer. I turned away, unable to look at him. "You need to leave. Now." This time he didn't argue. He walked past me, and I waited until I heard the door close before collapsing onto the couch, tears streaming down my face. The next few days were a blur. Mark didn't come home. He didn't call. And Ryan stayed away, respecting the boundaries I had finally forced between us. I spent most of my time replaying every moment, every glance, every touch, wondering how I had let things spiral so far out of control. The guilt was crushing. I thought about calling Mark, but what would I even say? How could I explain what had happened when I barely understood it myself? It wasn't until a week later that Mark finally came home. I was in the kitchen when I heard the door open, and my stomach twisted into knots. "Mark!" I called out hesitantly. He walked in, looking exhausted. "We need to talk," he said. I nodded, bracing myself. We sat down at the kitchen table, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "Is there something going on between you and Ryan?" I opened my mouth to deny it again, but the words caught in my throat. "I don't know," I admitted. He stared at me, his jaw tightening. "You don't know." "It wasn't what you think," I said quickly. "Nothing happened. But you wanted it to," he said, his voice hollow. I burst into tears. I don't know what I wanted. I was confused and lonely, and I let things get out of hand. "But I swear, Mark, it never went further than a kiss." "A kiss," he repeated, his voice breaking. I reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "I need time," he said, standing up. "I can't do this right now." "Mark, please." I said I need time, he snapped before walking out of the room. The days that followed were torture. Mark stayed in the house, but he barely spoke to me. He slept in the guest room and avoided me at every turn. I tried to give him space, but the distance was unbearable. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I found him in the garage, sitting on the workbench, staring at nothing. "I love you," I said softly. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with hurt. "Do you?" he asked. "Yes," I said, my voice trembling. "I made a mistake, but it didn't mean anything." "It meant something," he said bitterly. "Because it almost destroyed us." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. I'll go to therapy, I'll give you time, whatever you need. But please don't give up on us." He didn't respond right away, but after what felt like an eternity, he finally nodded. "I'm not ready to forgive you," he said. "But I'm willing to try." And for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The days that followed Mark's decision to try felt like walking a tightrope. We were careful with each other, too careful, like we were afraid any sudden movement would make the fragile balance between us shatter. I started therapy first. I needed to confront what had led me to that moment with Ryan, to peel back the layers of guilt, loneliness, and resentment I'd been burying for years. Therapy forced me to face myself, the woman I'd become, the choices I'd made, and the cracks in my marriage I had ignored until they couldn't be fixed with quick apologies or half-hearted smiles. Mark eventually joined me for couples counseling, though he didn't speak much in the beginning. He was guarded, and I couldn't blame him. "How do I trust her again?" he asked one night during a session. The question made my stomach twist, because I didn't have an answer. I couldn't make him trust me. All I could do was show him every single day that I was willing to fight for us. And I did. I stopped hiding behind distractions. I listened when he spoke, even when the words were hard to hear. I let him be angry. I let him cry. I let him doubt me because I knew he needed time. And slowly, painfully, things began to shift. Mark started opening up about his own struggles. He admitted that he'd felt like he wasn't enough for me, like no matter how hard he worked, I was slipping away. Hearing that broke me because I had felt the same way. We had both been drowning in silence, and instead of reaching for each other, we let the distance grow until it felt impossible to close. But now we were trying. Ryan, on the other hand, had moved out shortly after everything fell apart. He said he needed space, and I didn't fight him on it. I heard from him occasionally, a text here and there, mostly polite updates about work and life, but we never talked about what had happened. And maybe that was for the best. I still thought about him sometimes, not in the way I had before, but as a reminder of how easily lines can blur when emotions go unchecked. He was young, confused, and lonely just like I had been. But the difference was, I should have known better. And now I had to live with that. Moral reflection. Looking back, I realized that what happened between Ryan and me wasn't just about temptation. It was about vulnerability. It was about two people who were lost and looking for something to fill the emptiness they felt. But the truth is, no moment of passion is worth the wreckage it leaves behind. I learned that real love, the kind that lasts, takes work. It takes honesty, patience, and forgiveness, even when it hurts. I also learned that boundaries aren't just about what you won't do. They're about what you value and protect. And if you're not careful, the lines you think are clear can blur faster than you ever thought possible. Mark and I are still rebuilding. Some days are easier than others, but we're stronger now, more honest, more aware of each other's needs. And while I'll never forget what happened, I'm determined to make sure it never happens again. Because love isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing each other, even when it's hard. And this time I'm choosing to stay. What would you do if a moment of weakness threatened to destroy everything you'd built? Could you face your mistakes and fight to rebuild trust? Or would you walk away? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want more emotional, thought-provoking tales about love, betrayal, and redemption, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. You won't believe what's coming next.